good to be with you all this morning, and I'm glad my friend Terry has invited me to pinch hit for him. I look forward someday to meeting all of you in person. I want to read our text for this morning from Matthew chapter 13. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom, the weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. Nearly every day I get a letter, a phone call, an email, or a social media post which has the jarring tone of the emergency broadcast system alert on television, or of a police car's blaring siren. These messages have all the subtlety of a brick thrown through a plate glass window, all the nuance of a sledgehammer. The message senders want to be sure that I know there's a war going on, a battle for the heart and soul of, and you just fill in the blank, a battle for the heart and soul of Western civilization, the nation, our community, the church, the family, or our children and grandchildren. They're hoping to enlist me in their cause, to recruit me for their crusade against enemies at the gate and barbarians marauding in the street. It's a matter for them of right versus wrong, good against evil, the children of light locked in a struggle with the children of darkness. My response inevitably disappoints the alarm sounders and enlisters, because I almost never join their movements. I'm generally skeptical about crusades. And I'm wary about people who seem to have all the answers, even when it's evident that they don't have nearly all the questions. I'm especially nervous about what happens when leaders think that they can divide the world into two camps of people, supporters and opponents, friends and enemies, red and blue, good and bad. Now, I know there are serious problems we need to address. And I know that we need to make meaningful distinctions between just and unjust, right and wrong, good and evil. We who follow Jesus join him in making peace, practicing reconciliation, showing mercy, and offering grace. I'm just not convinced that the alarm sounders and crusade leaders understand how human beings are wired up, or that they know how amazingly loving God is. The would-be crusaders forget that evil doesn't just exist out there in them, in the strangers and the others. Evil exists in us too, in me and in you. I'm sure you've heard these wise and sobering words from Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He said, every heart has the capacity for good or evil. If only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Every heart balances the devil and sainthood, but it is still just one heart. Jesus told a parable which cautions us about our tendency to divide people into two camps, into the good and the bad, as if there were no badness in the good people and no goodness in the bad people. And this parable also invites us to a kind of holy reluctance to judge and condemn others and ourselves. Jesus said a farmer sowed wheat in his field, but during the night, an enemy sowed weeds in it. When the plants sprouted up, farmhands went to the farmer, told him that weeds were growing with the wheat, and asked, "Didn't you plant wheat? Where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy has done this," the farmer said. "Do you want us to pull up the weeds?" they asked, assuming that the answer would be yes. Instead, the farmer said, "No, if you pull up the weeds, you might also pull up the wheat. Let them grow together until harvest time. Then I'll tell the harvesters to gather up the weeds and tie them into bundles for use in fueling fires, and to gather up the wheat and put it in the barn." Now, Matthew and his church remembered this story as Jesus' promise that evil wouldn't stand forever. And they needed that promise because they were being persecuted by the same kind of adversaries who crucified Jesus. This parable helped them to trust that one day God would make everything right. One day the righteous would shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The parable does something else. It invites us to reflect on the patience of God. God is in no hurry to exercise final and irreversible judgment. If we can hear it well, this parable will slow us down in our own mad rush to judgment. In other words, it will help us resist the strong temptation to play God. Notice the farmer's surprising response to his farmhands when they asked if he wanted them to get the weeds out of the field. "No," he said, "for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest." Remember now, this parable, like all of Jesus' parables, is about the rule and realm of God. It's not a case study in agriculture. Allowing a field to overflow with weeds surely isn't a best practice for a thriving and productive farm. The story is instead meant to yield faithful, loving disciples, not more bushels of wheat per acre. Jesus' idiosyncratic farmer saw a problem with an early attempt to separate weeds from wheat. Beneath the surface, the roots of all the plants in the field were intertwined, so plucking out the weeds would risk damaging the wheat. Before the plants fully matured, it would be easy to mistake stalks of wheat for stands of weeds. And so the farmer refused to let his servants make early distinctions between wheat and weeds. He said that when the time came, he would instruct the harvesters in what to do. Until then, he said, let the wheat and the weeds grow together. When Jesus interpreted the parable, he made it clear that the Son of Man was in charge of judgment and that it would occur on his terms and on his timetable. And you and I are to stay out of the judgment business. We're not to play God to one another. Jesus didn't call and doesn't call his disciples to be district attorneys to bring charges against other people. A church isn't a grand jury. A church leader isn't a small claims court judge. None of us knows enough about someone else to judge him or her. And so we're challenged not to do it. All of us, and every group of which we're a part, the church included, are wheat and weeds together. A preacher once asked a class of children, if all the good people in the world were red and all the bad people were green, what color would you be? Little Linda Jean thought for a long minute and she said, Reverend, I'd be streaky. We all would be. Jesus' parable acknowledges and wants us to acknowledge that we will all be streaky. We're wheat and weeds. Our souls grow both the fruit of the Spirit and wild oats. Beneath the surface of our lives, beneath the surface, our thoughts, motives, and feelings are intertwined and interconnected. Everything in our lives is mixed up with everything else. Joy and sorrow lie close together, so close that we laugh until we cry and cry until we laugh. Love and anger are wrapped up with each other, which is why we get most frustrated, even furious, with the people we most love. Despair and hope are bound up with each other, which explains the existence of these little cliches of folk wisdom. It's always darkest before the dawn, and when you've hit bottom, you finally found a solid place to stand. In Romans 7, Paul admitted openly the wheat and weeds which were growing in his own heart. Paul was mystified and troubled by how incapable he was of getting the weeds out of his spirit. They often choked the life out of what he intended to be and do. He said, remember, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. I find it to be a law, he said, that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. Since that's true for all of us, doesn't it make sense to assume that it's true for other people too? They're at least as complex as we are, and they struggle at least as much as we do. It's not our task, and this is a relief. It's not our task to sort through the bad and the good in other people's lives. It's not our responsibility to straighten out all the twisted things in their minds, hearts, and actions. It's not our calling to stand in for God in overseeing and managing other people's lives. We're called instead to live freely and abundantly, to live wisely and tenderly, to speak truthfully and mercifully, to serve joyfully and compassionately, to welcome warmly and graciously, and to leave the rest to God. I agree with Tom Long, who said, so it is with the kingdom, so it is with the church. The doors are thrown open, the programs are open to all. Into the church come people who are serious about the things of God and people who are looking for a pretty sanctuary in which to get married. People show up who are hungry to be righteous, and people come because their spouse sings in the choir and they can't figure out what to do with themselves. The life of God's people is wonderfully non-discriminatory. Everybody is welcome to come along for the ride. The job of sifting the serious from the frivolous, The authentic from the fraudulent is left to the angels. In the meantime, the grace of God flows freely and hopefully. The grace of God is for everyone, for all of them, and for us too. Far too many of us think our failures are too great. Our hearts are too damaged. Our fears are too overwhelming, and our sins are too serious for there to be much hope for us. We've judged and sentenced ourselves. We've judged and sentenced ourselves to imprisonment by the past and to lonely confinement in our current circumstances. But since God postpones judgment, who are we to condemn ourselves? We don't know enough. We don't know enough about ourselves, to be sure, and we don't know enough about God even more. It's never too late to welcome God's forgiveness and to experience God's joy. It ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over yet. God is more loving than we have known, more determined to rescue us than we have imagined, and more present to help us than we have believed. Thanks be to God. Amen.